So happy to be with you and get to know your audience a little better.
Yeah, so just for a little background on what we're doing, as I'm sure you already know to some degree, but the Hero's Journey podcast is a project piloted, spearheaded by our executive director, Andrew Kimbrell at the Center for Food Safety. And essentially, we want to highlight activist voices through the lens of Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, because it is such an archetypal, popular way of viewing how we develop and how we get to where we are. So, in that vein, can you tell us a little bit about what is the hero's journey and why do you think it's important?
Absolutely. Well, the question of what the hero's journey is a bit of an interesting one because in some ways, the hero's journey is something that human beings have been participating in for thousands of years. It's relatively new in our conscious minds. And while a few other people had the opportunity to gain insights into it, it really was in 1949 when Joseph Campbell wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces that he articulated this idea of what he at the time called the hero's adventure. And what the hero's adventure was this concept or motif that he saw play out in all of the most profound stories that had impacted human beings throughout history. So sometimes those stories were fictional stories that came from our imagination, like the story of Odysseus or the story of Hercules. Other times, they were stories that played out through history, as we might see with the history of the Buddha. Other times, still, these were stories that played out through the myths. And for those who may be unaware of how to differentiate a story from a myth is really a story that we use to make sense of the world around us. And so the hero's journey, as Campbell saw it, really had these three significant parts. Now, in our modern world, people have added all these stages and different, concepts, and these were things Campbell talked about. But at its most basic level, the hero's journey involves some sort of departure, which is basically the hero or the heroic force determining, we can't go on living the way that we're living. Something has to change. And so it's this departure, this leaving of the present stasis that we're in. The second part of the hero's journey is what Campbell referred to as the initiation phase. Now, this is where things get difficult. After we decide things can't be the way that they've been, then we enter this place where things become challenging. And we have what Campbell called the road of trials. However, we also have all these forces that step in to help us and give us guidance and aid. And finally, at the end of that initiation phase, we are able to lay our hands on this thing that we've longed for, whether it is a new insight or whether it's a new idea, or sometimes metaphorically, it may be something like the Holy Grail or the Ark of the Covenant if we're Indiana Jones. But oftentimes it's a new way of thinking. It's a new way of seeing the world. And then finally, the third phase of the hero's journey is called the return. And the return is where the hero or the heroic force takes this thing that they have been pursuing and that they've finally been able to lay their hands on, and they bring that back to the community that they initially departed from. So it's not just about a single individual finding a new insight or finding a new way of being in the world, but the third part of the hero's journey is really about bringing that back into community and embracing a new way of living and new possibilities for everyone in the community the hero departed from. So that's a really basic idea of what the hero's journey is. But as you can see, it's sort of a philosophical, psychological idea that we can see a lot of different things actually playing into.
Yeah, sure. Well, and it's so relatable. Anybody could be a hero in that vein, living in their purpose. It sounds like it's very deeply resonant with you. And so how do you feel about it? I mean, you work for the Joseph Campbell Foundation, but have you noticed it in your daily life? Do you find it's removing? Well, how does it, what's your relationship with the hero's journey?
I'm so glad you asked because it has impacted my daily life, and it's also impacted the way that I navigate through the world. Because so often I like to at least believe that I'm growing in new areas and then I'm growing in different areas of my life. And so if we look at, that initial phase of the hero's journey of departure, I'm often departing the old self that I was and embracing some sort of new idea or new way of being in the world, or at least that's what I long to do.
Mhm,
But then when I try and do that, when I try and enter a new way of being, it's hard, right?
mhm,
I decide I'm going to be someone who gets up every morning and reads the classics. Oh, I can't go on living without not reading the classics every morning. But wow, that first morning that I wake up and I attempt to do it, whew, it's hard. I'm sleepy. I want to go back to sleep, right? The road of trials is there, but
mhm,
maybe some wind is put in my sails. Maybe I have a friend who says, I'll get up every morning also, and we'll call each other and we'll read the classics to each other. So maybe some supernatural force or some aid comes out of nowhere to help us on that journey. But then, I find myself being impacted by these things, and I want to share them with my community. So I began studying story and myth 25, 30 years ago. And over my lifetime, I have really gained so much through the study of story and myth. And now I find myself wanting to bring that back to a larger
mm,
community. And not just for the benefit of my own ego, I also want to make the path wide for those who also have discovered things and want to bring those back to the community as well. One of the things that has been going through my mind a lot lately about how do I live out this hero's journey
mhm,
is I've been thinking a lot about the collective heroic journey. What does it
mhm,
mean for not just me to go on this hero's journey, but us as a culture, us as a society, us as a nation, us as a city or a town or a neighborhood? What does it mean for us to do that together?
mhm,
I believe we're entering a new phase of consciousness that sort of thinking is going to be even more important than how I, as an individual, go on my own journey. Now, we're always going to have both, right? It's never going to be just the individual or just the collective. But I think we have often, especially in the Western culture, been very individually focused, where it's just all
mhm,
about me. But I can see the importance rising every day of us embracing this journey together as a collective. And honestly, I think it's one of the reasons why I am excited about your work and excited about the work of what you and your team are doing. Is it's not just for the benefit of an individual, although an individual does very much benefit from embracing, the principles that you're putting forth, but it's also about a larger journey that we could all take together and ideas that we could embrace as a collective.
mhm. Yeah, I think about the collective piece a lot too. And I do wonder if I'd be curious to know what you think. I mean, for me as a young person, there's just so many different existential things happening, culminating, and I wonder mm, if that catalyzes this need for more collective reunion anyway, which is sort of unfortunate and kind of inevitably necessary when we've created a society that is so individually focused.
Well, it's very necessary, and I'm reminded of the story about an adventurer in the late 1800s who was first exploring the northern parts of North America, and would stand out on the bow of the ship every night and notice something in the sky, that there was something mysterious happening. There was something like a stew was being stirred, in the sky. And one night that adventurer went to his cabin and he went to bed. And in the middle of the night, one of the other sailors burst in his door and he threw the door open and he said, "Captain, Captain, come quick. The world is on fire." And what was happening was the northern lights had begun to appear, and the northern lights were in the sky. Well, I've thought a lot about that story and how it applies in our day and age. We have a lot of people bursting in the door right now telling us the world is on fire.
Yeah.
And I myself wake up a lot of mornings feeling like, oh my goodness, the world is on fire. What are we going to do? I'm trying to gain the insight that maybe what appears to be the world on fire is actually something I just don't understand yet. Perhaps there are northern lights on the horizon that look frightening, that look scary, but perhaps there's something larger at work. And just maybe, there's something better in the future waiting for us, that if we're willing to do our part and to work hard and do the due diligence, we're going to gain the vision and understanding of what we thought was, when we first saw it, disastrous for us. At least that's my hope when I look out into the world.
That's my hope as well. Just to go back, can you tell me a little bit about who was Joseph Campbell and what was his, I mean, you mentioned how he came to this theory, but what was his vision for the world?
Joseph Campbell was a really fascinating person in that he was a man of a different time that in some ways was very much ahead of his time. And in other ways, he was a man very much of his time. And, the time that he was born in and that he grew up in, it was a time when individuals often would take some time after they finished their initial schooling to go out and see the world a bit.
Well, so wait, just for our listeners, what time was that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this would have been like the 1920s that he's finished his schooling and he's decided to go out and see the world a bit. And there are a lot of young people today, by the way, that want to take a gap year or take some time, and often we get nervous about that and say, oh, if you don't keep going to school, you'll never finish now. And I think it's a healthy thing to take some time to go and explore the world a bit and see, what's out there. And that was just what Joseph Campbell decided to do. And so he spent some time in other countries in his 20s, and he began to notice there were a lot of different ways that cultures participated in the human experience. But he also noticed that there were a lot of similarities. There were things that tended to bring people together on an experiential level. And Campbell was initially interested in this. I should rewind even a little further back to the aughts, as we call them, the early 1900s, when his parents took him to one of Wild Bill's Wild West shows. And Wild Bill Hickok had these Wild West shows that he would put on. And it was the first time that, as a little boy, Joseph Campbell encountered the indigenous people of this country. And First Nations people of the United States were part of this show. And he was fascinated. Joseph Campbell was fascinated by their dances, their rituals, their language, and their stories. And he began to fall in love with their stories, even from a very young age. And this really was a springboard for him becoming interested in the mythological traditions. And when we say mythological traditions, a lot of people immediately gravitate to the idea of, say, Greek mythology or Norse mythology. But every single culture and people group in the global society has their own stories of why things are the way they were and how things came to be. And some of these stories have been embraced outside of those cultures, and we refer to them now as religious traditions. But even the religious traditions in the world today are at their core mythological belief systems about the way that the world works. So Joseph Campbell, in his travels, began to encounter these different systems, and in trying to make sense of them, he came back after his travels, and he moved to upstate New York and decided that he was going to take some time in his life and just read. And he spent a couple of years just reading. Fortunately, he had some resources and a member of his family that he could just devote time to doing that. Many of us are jealous, would love to spend a couple of
Yeah,
years
I would love to
reading.
spend a couple of years reading.
Wouldn't you? Right. Well, Campbell got to do that. He got to go spend a couple of years reading. And when he emerged from that experience, he had some things to say about how he felt the world worked. And that's really where he begins to write about these things. And he initially collaborates with another writer, and they write about the work of James Joyce. They create a book called A Skeleton's Key to Finnegan's Wake. And so they look deeply at what we might refer to as the mythological truths of this work by James Joyce, which a lot of people at the time really scratched their head. If you've never read the work of James Joyce before, you may crack open Finnegan's Wake and really be in for a shocking surprise and put the book right back down if you don't have some sense of what it is you're reading. But Campbell was interested in cracking mysteries. He was interested in looking deeper into the mysterious and coming up with some way that we might be able to attach a string to it, that we could connect it to ourselves. And that played open even more widely when he wrote the Hero with a Thousand Faces, because he wanted to take these stories, these rituals, these myths, and help us bring some sort of relevance into our daily lives from them. And he spent, the rest of his life in many ways bringing awareness to myth. And many people didn't encounter Campbell until the very end of his life. He did a program on PBS with Bill Moyers called The Power of Myth. And for many people, that was the first encounter they had. And many people then learned that actually Joseph Campbell had a profound impact on a young man from Northern California named George Lucas, who was working on this space opera he was trying to craft. He encounters Campbell's work, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. He completely restructures and rewrites Star Wars. And Campbell and Lucas became dear friends, and they had a relationship for the rest of Campbell's life. but that was sort of near the end of his work and his journey. He had spent all this other time helping us understand why myth had so much significance in the human experience.
Mm. I didn't know that about Star Wars. Maybe I'm a little too young to have resonated with that, but that's
Yeah,
very interesting. Yeah. So Star Wars is in a lot of ways a translation of the hero's journey, right?
there is very few um, films that are so by the book, the hero's journey, more so than Star Wars. Now, what
Mm,
happened, interestingly enough, uh, Hollywood saw the massive success of Star Wars and the way that that film was structured. And a number of screenwriters and filmmakers began to adopt these
mm,
motifs and these templates. And um, we could say that a lot of films, even that come out today, are very much through the lens of the hero's journey and adhere to the template of the hero's
hmm
journey. And that's even caused a lot of pushback in some areas. Some people have felt like, well, films after that just became very formulaic. Everyone was trying to tell,
mm,
this very similar story. Um, what's interesting though was Joseph Campbell, when he identified this, was never trying to be prescriptive. He was never trying to say, oh, stories should be told always like this. He was trying to be descriptive. He was
mm,
identifying a pattern that he saw throughout history in the world. And Joseph Campbell had also become very fascinated by the work of Carl Jung. And Carl Jung, of course, was interested in the human experience psychologically. And
hmm
so Campbell believed that these patterns that he was seeing emerge throughout literature and history, that they were somehow connected to the psychological experience of human beings as well. And
mm,
that we actually experienced this heroic journey, or what Campbell referred to sometimes as the monomyth, this one great story, um, even in the most simplest actions of our day-to-day life. Now, one thing that's a bit interesting in more recent days, neuroscientists have begun to understand the processes of the human brain. And there's some research out there now that suggests that the hero's journey is so resonant with us because, in many ways, it mirrors the way that human beings solve problems psychologically.
cool.
Yeah. So it's no wonder that there's such resonance in the stories we tell. When we go to see a good movie, we love to see a character solve a problem because subconsciously we think, if they can solve their problems, maybe, just maybe, I can solve mine.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. I wanted to ask you a question. Oh, I'm just thinking about so Joseph Campbell, so when he passed away, do you think he had any idea the scope with which his beliefs were going to be spread?
I think no one was more surprised than Joseph Campbell. Towards the end of his life, when this massive popularity began to, um, uh, enter his world, I think he was quite surprised because there were decades that there were only a select small group of people interested in his work. The Hero with a Thousand Faces was written in 1949. Joseph Campbell, after that, went on to write book after book after book after book, and there were always some people interested. But when he got into the later season of his life, he began to have trouble even finding people interested in publishing his work.
Mm,
But then at the end, this international acclaim comes to him through the power of myth and through George Lucas and these cultural figures, beginning to all point to his work. Um, it's a beautiful story in some ways because he was greatly rewarded at the end of his journey. But I think for Campbell, he was an interesting guy in that he really resisted ever writing an autobiography, and he really wasn't wild about the idea of people focusing on him and his life. He wanted things to stay about the ideas.
Mm.
So even at the Joseph Campbell Foundation, while we have this great respect and admiration for Joseph Campbell as a person, we really try and honor what Campbell wanted, and that was to keep things about the ideas, because it's the ideas that he was able to articulate that we can tap into today and then carry ourselves and do something new with those ideas. So, after Campbell outlined this idea about the hero's journey, there was a woman who stood up at one of his talks and lectures, a woman named Maureen Murdoch, and she stood up and she said, "Well, what about women? Because a hero is only one type of character in a story. What about the heroine's journey?"
Mm.
And Joseph Campbell wisely said, "You're going to have to open that up and to tell that story, because we need to hear that from you." Joseph Campbell recognized he wasn't the one to articulate what the heroine's journey would be. So Maureen Murdoch goes on to write a book called The Heroine's Journey that was tremendously impactful. A new edition of it just came out a year or so ago. I saw a photo in a magazine a year or two ago of Brie Larson and preparing to play in the Marvel
Marvel,
film.
yeah.
Yeah, she was reading The Heroine's Journey, by Maureen Murdoch. And now, as we've looked, at the hero's journey, the heroine's journey, I really believe this collective journey of what does it look like when we set aside, our various individual egos and genders and all those things. What does it look like for us to move forward as a collective and go on a journey as a collective? And I think Campbell would be delighted with the progression of these ideas, because that's what good ideas do. We grow them, we build on them. We don't just stay with them and get stagnant,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, just to go back, just for listeners, and I didn't know that the heroine's journey existed. How is it different from the hero's journey?
Such a great question. And by the way, Maureen Murdoch is a dear friend of mine. She's still living. She actually was she's been a mentor to me, and she actually served as the chair on my dissertation committee, which was a huge honor for me. But the heroine's journey is different in that while the hero's journey is this very external journey that involves, you go here and you do this and you fight this battle and dragon, the heroine's journey is very much a journey inward. It's a very internal journey, and it has some slightly different stages. There are, for example, in the hero's journey, there's one stage that deals with the reconciliation with the Father. Now, this is not just about a literal father that we reconcile with, but about reconciling with the larger masculine forces that are at work in the world. Well, with the heroine's journey, Maureen Murdoch talks about specific relationships between women and their mothers having a certain dynamic and energy, and that being core to the heroine's journey. One of the things I'll say about that, because it's easy for us to say, well, I'm a man, so I take the hero's journey, or I'm a woman, so I take the heroine's journey, or I'm non-binary, so I don't have either of the. But I think the thing to remember, whether it's Joseph Campbell or Maureen Murdoch or any of these other great thinkers, is when we talk about these journeys, we're talking about a certain type of energy. So I identify as a man, but I recognize inside of me, I have masculine energy, I have feminine energy. I try and find balances between these different types of energies inside of myself. And so I gained just as much reading the heroine's journey, as I would reading, the hero's journey, because this is a type of energy that's present inside of me as well. So I just want to be clear, that it's not
Yeah.
about finding the journey that somehow aligns most closely with how you identify, as much as understanding the larger psychological universe inside of you.
Hmm. Yeah, well, and even you could even say just the fact that we're influenced by the external and we're influenced by the internal, and you have to navigate both of them as you evolve. And the internal piece of knowing yourself is critical in taking those outward actions. So you really do need a balance.
That's right. We have to understand all of it. If we're going to find that sort of skillful health that I think we desire to be operating in, and
Hmm.
certainly we have to do that work for ourselves even before we can do it in that collective communal place. If we're unhealthy, we're not going to be able to operate well in community,
Yeah.
so we've got to, it's both and not either or.
Yeah, well, and just thinking about what you said about how when you take those, sorry, what's the middle phase called?
Oh
The
yeah, yeah.
trials.
Oh, the of the hero's journey, the middle
Yes.
phase. Yeah,
Yeah.
the initiation phase.
Yeah, so the initiation phase, if you're going to start something or you're going to change a paradigm or something in your life, a habit or something along those lines, I mean, something has to shift in you internally too. I am intrigued. I do want to ask you about your perception of a supernatural force of some sort, but it is also, I mean, you have to, it's most of our lives are just these tiny shifts in how we change. I mean, I just think about how, I have a meditation practice now and a journaling practice. And a couple of years ago, I thought to myself, how can I sit for 20 minutes? How can I even possibly do that? I don't have the capacity to, and just how we shift through some combination, I believe, of our own personal drive, but also something else. And I'm curious what your perception is of that something
I I'm going to answer this question in a bit of a
else.
unique way.
Okay,
um,
please.
and that is by talking a bit about what a mythologist does,
Okay.
because my training is as a mythologist. I have a PhD in mythology and depth psychology.
Mm.
And when people ask me, because when I sit on an airplane and someone says, "So what do you do?" and I say, "Oh, I'm a mythologist," people always raise an eyebrow and say, "What is a mythologist? What does a mythologist do?" What a mythologist does, we are they that study the stories around the mystery.
Mm.
And I would suggest to you that we, in our Western culture, have devalued mystery
Mm.
to our own detriment. So when you ask me about possibilities about something greater than ourselves,
Hmm.
about divine forces, something that we might feel the essence of or tap into, I am so delighted that I am unable to put specific articulation around so much of that, because I value the mystery. I love the mysterious nature of the mystery. And for me, um, it's become a healthy part of my own practice to acknowledge the mystery. I'll give you an example of this. I live in Los Angeles, and one of my joys of living in Los Angeles is being a member of an organization here called the Magic Castle. And the Magic Castle is a giant Victorian home that sits up on a hill here in Los Angeles. And it's a private club for magicians and those who love magic. And I love going to the Magic Castle. So I love taking guests and friends to the Magic Castle. And sometimes when I take friends to the Magic Castle, I have some friends that spend the entire evening, all they can talk about or think about is how the magician did the trick. And they just cannot rest until they have figured it out, until they have, and I am just not that person. I am a person who comes in and I love being overwhelmed with wonder. I love not knowing. I love the mystery of being able to let that particular effect that they've created wash over me and excite my emotions and touch that place deep inside of me that causes me to believe in something I don't understand that's so much greater than myself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Julia, I'll tell you, there's many people out there who I think have gotten much further down the path than myself and have found articulation for aspects of that mystery that I deeply admire and enjoy. And I'm not here to tell anyone who feels like they have some sort of insight about that mystery that they're wrong, or that I'm not here for that.
Mm-hmm.
I just know in my experience, the greater I encounter that mystery, the more expansive that mystery becomes, and the more in awe of that mystery that I find myself. So I know that's a bit of a swirly answer there.
No, I like it. I like it. I too, I relate to that, and sort of a sense of, I'm a very scientifically oriented person, but practicing surrender and trust in something I might not know has been very enriching. I mean, being a human so stuck and grounded in this reality and often feeling very stuck in it,
Yeah,
finding wonder has great value to feeling alive.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Well, and Joseph Campbell once said, actually, just to bring it back to Campbell for a moment,
Yeah.
Joseph Campbell once said he believed that people weren't so much looking for the meaning of life as much as they were the rapturous experience of being alive. I resonate with that. I don't have
Yeah.
to know what it all means, but oh, I crave that feeling of
Hmm.
aliveness.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking this is I'm going in a different direction now, but I'm just thinking, because I think people could interpret the hero's journey as formulaic, as described. And we meet a lot of people and talk to a lot of people on this podcast who have very clear purposes. I mean, they may have come to these purposes in different unconventional manner, but there was always something that drove them. And I'm just curious, what would you say, or what would Joseph Campbell say to someone who doesn't feel like they have that inside them? They feel they're lost. Or where are they on their journey if you're lost?
Yeah. Well, I feel like being lost on your journey is one of the best places you can be.
Hmm.
Because if you can recognize that you feel lost, that's the first step in
Mm.
moving towards something. There's a lot of people out there that are lost that don't even recognize they're lost.
Mm.
And so for you to be able to say, hey, I'm lost, this is a great first step. I, for many years in my life, found myself on this path. And I'll tell you, I grew up in a very fundamental tradition that I often saw my journey as being like trying to stand up on top of this giant metal ball that was covered in oil. And I was
Mm.
constantly falling off of it. And I just all the time was trying to get up back up and just always be standing on top of that ball. And at some point in my life, I recognized that that was not the metaphor that was serving me. And instead, I began to embrace this metaphor of being on this hiking trail at night and recognizing there was some people or someone a little further up the trail. And I found myself sometimes making a great deal of noise to say, hey, you who are further up the trail than me, would you shine a little bit of light that I
Mm.
might could try and get up to where you are, on the trail. And that metaphor of the hiking trail became so much more resonant for what the journey actually was for me.
Mhm.
So I know so many people and have been there so many times myself where you feel lost and you feel like I don't know where I'm going or where I should be going. And I just feel overwhelmed and tired. And I don't know. And this is very much a condition of our age. We live in a very fast-paced world. But can I suggest that people have been feeling that way for a long time? I will never forget the first time that I read Herman Melville's novel, Moby Dick. And
Mm.
it begins, with this character of Ishmael saying that he had grown tired of everything on the docks and the shore. And that was why he decided to set out on the seas.
Mm.
I think there's something to that. I think many
Yeah.
of us have grown tired and we've grown weary with life on the
Mhm.
shore. And the water is a beautiful symbol of the unconscious. And so many of us, I think, crave something beyond what we can see and touch, something beyond those routines of our day-to-day life. And I would encourage you by suggesting that that journey is available to every person because it's a journey inward. It's a
Mhm.
journey you can step off the dock and begin to take whenever you're ready. It's
Mhm.
hard work. It's frustrating. It's as difficult as any external journey could ever be. But you are the one who gets to paddle the boat. You are the one who gets to raise the sails. You are the one who gets to recognize when it's time to rest and it's time for adventure and it's time to keep on keeping on and it's time to pursue. But that adventure is available to every single person. And the first step in any adventure is just what we said with the hero's journey. It is a dissatisfaction with the way things are.
Mm.
That departure is about dissatisfaction. So if you are someone who's feeling a sense of dissatisfaction, whether that's lostness, whether that's boredom, whether that's overwhelm, whatever that is, you are a prime candidate for departure
Mm.
and moving into that initiation phase, which doesn't get any easier. Wow, you begin to feel alive.
Yeah. Well, so does I think about this a lot. Does Joseph Campbell discuss this interrelatedness between how you feel on the inside and how it reflects your external world? I assume he discusses this.
He very much does. And, fortunately, some of the people who lived and worked with Campbell, are alive today and still, talking about experiences they have. And your question reminds me of a story that my friend Bob Walter, who for many years served as the executive director of the Joseph Campbell Foundation, Bob
Mm.
Walter would often share this story about when they were trying to get one of Campbell's books published and just having a very difficult time getting anyone to want to publish the book. And Bob had become very frustrated and discouraged. And he asked Joseph Campbell, he said, do you ever get discouraged? And Campbell said, well, I'm a human being. Of course I get discouraged. Why do you ask? And he said, well, because I'm feeling pretty discouraged right now. We're doing all this work. And Campbell said, well, whenever I get discouraged, I just go back to the work. I just go back to putting one foot in front of the next and doing the next thing, because that was what Campbell sustained himself with. And it was going back to putting one foot in front of the other on the journey, going further down the path in the work. And if you find work in the world that is meaningful to you, you're able to return to that. And it does bring life to you. Now, many of us make the mistake of thinking that work has to be the thing that pays our bills. And that may or may not be the case. And there may be seasons of life when it does pay the bills and other seasons when it doesn't. But our work in the world, it may be, it may or may not be mutually exclusive from what we do to make a living. I know a lot of people who they really lament the fact that the way they may make a living is not their true work in the world. And I set in a place of privilege with that, and that my calling and my work in the world aligns with how I make a living. But I recognize that that's not true for a lot of people. And I can say I spent decades where that was not the case, by the way, as well. I've been there. However, even when I was not able to align the way that I made a living with my work in the world, it was still that work that sustained me when the living got hard. Do you relate to that? Is that you as well?
Yes. And on my own hero's journey, I've had to spend a lot of time confronting myself and who am I authentically? There's so much conditioning that we go through, particularly through the teenage years and whatnot, where we're told that we're supposed to be these things. Not just teenage years, but the teenage years, I think, can be harmful in that it can take away your essence in certain ways. So, for example, I was shy for many years after my adolescence, but I knew I wasn't actually shy. So it was an interesting inner reflection of who would I be if I wasn't shy, if I didn't have this conditioning, and what would I do, and what fundamentally lights me up. And I've been learning over time, the more inner work I've done, what really lights me up, and how to pursue that, while also knowing that probably not going to make any money from it. But that's okay. It doesn't matter. It's as long as you have that like inner fire lit, you keep going. But another thing I wanted to ask you about, I'm just thinking about Joseph Campbell and Star Wars, and how he took these stories from indigenous communities and translated them. So there's a movie that came out recently. It's called Vengeance. Have you
Oh,
seen it?
I love that you brought this up. BJ Novak is a brilliant writer, and I think this film is just tremendous. I love the film.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I thought it was very thought provoking. But there's a
absolutely.
line in it where Ashton Kutcher's talking, and he says something. I'm going to quote it incorrectly, so if you
Yeah.
remember it, please tell me. But he says something about how, like, BJ Novak's project of the podcast, or when you're writing, or you're a journalist, or anything, or maybe even when you're just writing a song, it's just your translation. It's your individual translation. And I think with the internet and so much being spread and all this stuff, I think it's easy for people to think, well, why is my voice special? What am I going to say that's going to be different from somebody else? And I think that can really divert from aligning with your hero's journey and your purpose, because you can feel like, I feel like I have something to say, but then you go, well, no one's going to care, your negative ego. And I just found this line very resonant, because I thought, oh, well, maybe the point is for us to have all of these translations that come at something from all these different lenses so that we can, I mean, that's how you shift a consciousness, right? Everyone, you don't know who you'll reach. You might
That's right.
reach someone who someone else can't reach. You just
That's right.
don't, I mean, and so someone might read Joseph Campbell's books. Someone might be a philosopher and find that very resonant. And someone else might be like, this is boring.
Yeah.
I don't
That's
relate
right.
to this, you know?
Right.
Versus watching Star Wars and, engaging with it in that way. I just think we forget everyone learns so differently, and how we relate to things is so different. And that's why everyone has a role to play.
Oh, you are singing my song. This is this is something I'm so passionate about because
Yeah.
having spent so much of my life studying and storytelling and telling stories, um, oftentimes when I work with storytellers and writers, they become very fearful of, oh, am I going to tell a story that somebody else has already told? Am I going to repeat, ground someone else's? I always encourage them that first of all, the wisdom tradition that brought us Solomon says there's nothing new under the sun. But here's the thing: the world has never heard you tell your story. The world has never heard it that way before, and we need it. We need every single person to share their story through their lens, the way they see the world, because when we leave out voices, we're all missing something. We all miss something when voices get left out. And those of us who have a greater platform and greater opportunity, we have to then make sure there's room on the stage for all the other voices to come and be a part of that, so that we're forming this beautiful choir of voices, because there's something more powerful about hearing that collective choir than even a single voice. But just as you said, sometimes that single voice will reach one person that could never be reached through this other thing. There's a lot of people that will never read the work of Joseph Campbell, but they love Star Wars. And so those ideas that come through that were translated by George Lucas, look at the work that it's doing in the world.
Yeah.
You may be the Campbell to someone else's Lucas, and what powerful work that could be in the world.
Yeah. Well, and you might have an idea that you feel is profound, or a conceptual framework like Joseph Campbell, and you have no idea how that's going to spread. You have no idea. I mean, and I guess that's the point of people write things, all sorts of people write things, and they don't
Yeah,
know
yeah,
that they have no idea what the impact will be. So you
that's
just
right.
have to write it because it lights you up, and just trust it.
That's right. That's
Or,
right.
do activism, and even if it feels small, and
Yeah.
just trust that it will
Yeah.
ripple.
Well, Julia, one thing that I think we often make a mistake in our culture is feeling like everyone has to have the same role. We all have
Yeah.
to be this. We all have to be that. It's one reason I love the title of Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, because we need every one of those faces. The heroic or the divine expresses in a bajillion different ways, and we need every one of those. And it's only when we say, well, this face is more valuable than this face, that we start to lose something. And if we can be in the business of appreciating the wide spectrum, and have gratitude that it's not just this homogenous single face, that people get so bored with, right? When there's only one way to access the divine, people it tends to divide people and say, well, yeah, that's not for me, so I guess I'm out on my own.
Yeah.
um yeah.
Yeah.
We both enjoy that same energy for that. I love it so much.
Yeah. No, this has been an a great conversation. Um, well, so with the little time we have left, do you want to tell me a little bit about the Joseph Campbell Foundation and what does the foundation do?
Absolutely. Well, we work to preserve and protect and perpetuate the work of Joseph Campbell. We also work to bring those ideas forward in culture. So we've got a number of podcasts ourselves. Some of those you can hear Joseph Campbell speak on. Some
Mm.
of those are people that have been impacted by Campbell's work, comedians, philosophers, all sorts of people. But you can find out everything that we're up to, as well as a ton of things about Joseph Campbell at our website, which is jcf.org. And
We'll link
there,
it.
yeah, thank you. And in there, you can get to everything you'd ever want to know about the foundation, but also about Campbell. You can get to our social media handles. You can connect with us if you want to, ask us a question, or if you want to connect with us about anything. We exist for you. We exist for the community, and we want to be a resource to people who have felt a deeper sense of calling into this work.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time, John.
It was a pleasure, Julia. I greatly enjoyed the conversation.